Emily Saunders had been in a coma for 3 long months, and every hope of recovery seemed lost. But one ordinary morning, a 9-year-old boy named Liam wandered into her hospital room, unaware that a simple, innocent touch would spark a miracle that no doctor could explain. Emily Saunders had always been a force of nature in New York City, a woman whose presence commanded attention in boardrooms and social gatherings alike. At 42, she had built a successful chain of high-end boutiques and a reputation for determination that bordered on relentless. She was known for her sharp mind, unyielding drive, and the ability to solve problems that seemed impossible to others. But one rainy evening changed everything. Driving home from a late meeting, Emily navigated the slick streets with her usual precision, her thoughts scattered between her upcoming product launch and the endless stream of emails demanding her attention. The city lights blurred through the rain-streaked windshield, and she was exhausted but unwilling to surrender to fatigue. A sudden swerve from another vehicle, too fast, too reckless, left her with no time to react. The screech of tires, the violent impact, the crushing force of metal, everything happened in a fraction of a second. Yet it was enough to alter the course of her life entirely. Paramedics arrived quickly, working frantically to stabilize her before rushing her to New York General Hospital. Doctors assessed her injuries and immediately recognized the severity: traumatic brain injury, multiple fractures, internal bleeding. She was rushed into surgery, the beeping of monitors filling the operating room as surgeons worked tirelessly to save her life. Every movement, every carefully calculated incision was a race against time, and when the procedure was finally over, Emily was stable but unresponsive. She had survived the accident, but her mind had retreated into a world beyond reach, leaving her body functioning only with the help of machines. For days, then weeks, she lay in the hospital bed, her body tethered to ventilators, IV lines, and monitors that tracked every heartbeat, every drop in oxygen, every subtle fluctuation that hinted at life. Her family visited, speaking to her, holding her hand, reading aloud stories, but nothing stirred her from the depths she had fallen into. Each passing hour felt heavier than the last. Her daughter, Sarah, spent countless nights beside her, reading reports from doctors, questioning every beep on the monitor, searching for the smallest indication of recognition. The world outside moved on without pause, the city continuing its relentless rhythm, but inside Emily's hospital room, time seemed suspended. Medical professionals spoke cautiously, their words carefully measured. They had treated comatose patients before, some who awoke, some who did not, and they knew the unpredictable nature of the human brain. Prognoses were made, probabilities calculated, families prepared for the worst. Emily's condition was grave. Activity in her brain had been minimal, and while her vital signs remained stable thanks to medical intervention, there was no sign that she could respond to external stimuli. Doctors explained the situation to Sarah, emphasizing the need to prepare for the possibility that Emily might not recover. Each conversation was a delicate dance between honesty and hope, and each day that passed without change deepened the ache in Sarah's chest. Friends and colleagues sent messages of support, flowers arrived in the sterile hospital room, and yet nothing seemed to penetrate the barrier that had closed around Emily. Nurses tended to her needs with unwavering professionalism, adjusting tubes, changing bedding, administering medications. But even they recognized the unusual severity of her unresponsiveness. The hospital staff knew her story: Emily Saunders, the woman who could accomplish anything, now lying in a hospital bed, caught in a coma that defied explanation. And yet, despite the severity, there was still a rhythm to her body. Her heart beat steadily under the guidance of monitors, her lungs inflated with the assistance of machinery, and her fingers occasionally twitched in what doctors assumed were reflexive movements. It was a small, almost imperceptible sign, but in the sterile environment of the hospital, even these tiny signals were noted with meticulous care. Time blurred for Sarah, days merging into nights as she maintained a vigil by her mother's side. She recounted stories, played recordings of Emily's favorite music, whispered memories from childhood, hoping that somewhere within, some part of her mother could sense her presence. Her father, meanwhile, tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, managing the business in Emily's absence. But even he could not escape the shadow of worry that hung over the household. Friends offered support, yet it was never enough to fill the vast space left by Emily's absence. Outside the hospital walls, the city carried on, people moving through their lives unaware of the quiet battle unfolding in room 402. Emily Saunders, once a woman of influence and power, now existed in a state where her thoughts, her consciousness, were inaccessible, leaving only her physical body as evidence of life. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months. Each morning, the hospital staff would check monitors, consult with neurologists, review charts, and search for signs of change. Every small twitch, every variation in heartbeat, every flicker in eyelid movement was scrutinized for meaning. and still Emily remained beyond reach, a puzzle that no amount of medical expertise could solve. The family struggled to hold on to hope, clinging to memories of the woman who had been larger than life. Refusing to accept that she could be gone from them in this way, Sarah would sit by the bedside, her hand resting on her mother's, talking as if Emily could hear, recounting small moments from her day, hoping against reason that her voice might bridge the gap that medicine could not. For the doctors, it was a professional challenge and an emotional trial. They reviewed research, debated treatment options, and tried experimental approaches, all within the boundaries of ethical medical practice. Each decision carried weight and the burden of responsibility was palpable. Emily's body, despite the coma, persisted, a testament to the resilience of life itself. And it was into this setting, a hospital room in New York, 3 months after a devastating accident, surrounded by machines and the quiet hum of medical equipment, that fate would intervene in the most unexpected way. A chance encounter, a small human touch, would soon challenge everything the medical team thought they knew about recovery consciousness and the power of connection. Emily Saunders, the woman whose life had seemed paused indefinitely, was about to experience the first stirrings of a miracle that no chart, no monitor, and no prognosis could have predicted. The story of her recovery would not begin with science alone, but with something simpler, something pure and utterly human. Liam Parker had spent most of his 9 years navigating the streets of Brooklyn with a sense of independence and responsibility far beyond his age. His mornings were filled with the rhythm of selling candy and small snacks to commuters and delivery drivers rushing past traffic lights. His afternoons spent helping his grandfather, Henry, who had difficulty walking after years of labor in construction. Life had taught him quickly that the world could be unforgiving, and he had adapted, balancing the responsibilities at home with his small business on the corner of 5th Avenue and Franklin Street. That morning, Liam had woken earlier than usual, the crisp November air biting at his cheeks as he bundled himself in a worn jacket and headed toward his usual spot. He carried a small backpack with neatly wrapped candies, a few coins for change, and a notebook where he kept tally of his earnings. The city was already alive, buses wheezing around corners, car horns blaring, and pedestrians moving with a hurried determination that only New York could produce. Liam loved the energy, though he often wished for a quieter moment to think, a pause from the constant movement that seemed to define his existence. After a few hours of selling, a pressing need sent him looking for a restroom. Most of the small shops he passed were crowded or closed, and the familiar public facilities at the subway station were under repair. He wandered farther than he usually would, guided more by instinct than plan, past the office buildings where he had never dared to step before. Towering glass structures reflected the morning sun, gleaming like distant promises of a life he could not yet imagine. He found himself at the side entrance of New York General Hospital, a building he had passed countless times but never considered entering. The revolving doors loomed like a portal, and in his urgency, he slipped inside unnoticed, hoping to find relief quickly before returning to his routine. The lobby was sterile, brightly lit, with the faint scent of antiseptic that made Liam wrinkle his nose. Nurses moved briskly along corridors, wheeling equipment and talking into walkie-talkies, their footsteps echoing off the polished floors. Liam followed a sign indicating restrooms, weaving past people in scrubs, patients in wheelchairs, and visitors hurrying to appointments. The hospital felt like a labyrinth, each hallway indistinguishable from the next, with white walls and doors labeled in precise letters. He turned one corner then another when he realized he had completely lost his sense of direction. Panic threatened to rise, but he pushed it down, reminding himself that he had faced tricky situations before and could handle this too. As he tried to retrace his steps, a door at the end of the hallway caught his eye. It was slightly ajar, revealing a dimly lit room with a large hospital bed in the center. Curious and cautious, Liam pushed the door open further, expecting to find perhaps an empty storage area or a cleaning closet. Instead, he froze. There, lying motionless under crisp white sheets, was a woman whose presence seemed to dominate the room. Her chest rose and fell with the assistance of a ventilator, and tubes ran in and out with mechanical precision. Liam had seen people in the hospital before, but there was something different about this woman. Something that drew him in despite his confusion and fear. Her face was peaceful, yet there was a fragility to her that pulled at the instinctive compassion in him. Without overthinking, and acting as he had with his grandfather when he was sick at home, Liam reached out and gently tapped her hand. Then her arm, and finally, almost instinctively, touched her cheek lightly. It was a small gesture born of curiosity and care, yet in that instant, the monitors beside her flickered with new activity. Liam stepped back, startled, unsure if what he saw was real. He had not intended to do anything extraordinary, only to investigate and perhaps offer comfort. His heart raced, and he glanced around, expecting someone to appear and scold him for being where he shouldn't. Just then, the door opened fully and a nurse appeared, her eyes wide with shock as she saw him in the room. "What are you doing here?" she asked sharply, hurrying toward him. Liam stammered, explaining that he had only come in to find the bathroom and had gotten lost. The nurse's attention then shifted to the monitors, her frown deepening as she noticed the unusual readings. "Did you touch her?" she asked, a mix of alarm and disbelief in her voice. Liam nodded, a small, uncertain gesture, not fully understanding what had just happened. Meanwhile, Sarah Saunders, Emily's daughter, had entered the room to visit her mother at her usual time. She froze when she saw the small boy standing by the bed, his eyes wide with nervous curiosity. Her gaze quickly moved to her mother, and she caught sight of the subtle movements, fingers twitching, a brief shift in muscle, signals that hadn't appeared in weeks. Sarah's heart leapt. She approached the boy gently, unsure how to address the situation without causing a scene. "Hey, are you okay?" she asked softly, crouching to meet his level. Liam nodded, holding his backpack close, his voice barely above a whisper. I needed to go to the bathroom. I got lost," he said. Sarah glanced at the nurse, who was frantically gesturing for her to remove the boy from the room. But Sarah's instincts told her there was more at play. There was a spark, a reaction that defied explanation. She held Liam's hand, encouraging him to remain calm, and turned back to her mother. "Mom," she whispered, "did you see that?" Emily's monitors displayed changes, subtle but unmistakable, heart rate fluctuations, muscle twitches, and minor facial movements that had not occurred in months. The nurse argued that it was a reflex, a standard involuntary response. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this child had done something remarkable. Liam, oblivious to the significance of his actions, looked again at Emily, his expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. He tilted his head, noting the tubes and machines, but also recognizing a familiarity in her quiet presence, reminding him of his grandfather's bed at home. "Is she okay?" he asked. Sarah squeezed his hand, encouraging him gently. "Yes, she's okay." "UV helped her," she whispered, careful not to overstate what had just occurred. The nurse continued to mutter about protocols, about how a child shouldn't be in the room, but for Sarah, that moment was transformative. She saw the first glimpse of hope in 3 months, brought not by medicine or technology, but by a simple, compassionate act from a small boy who had wandered in by chance. Liam, unaware of the impact he had, remained near the bed, his eyes tracing every subtle movement, sensing something shifting in the woman before him. He felt an inexplicable connection, an unspoken understanding that his presence mattered. That morning would mark the beginning of a miracle, the start of a bond that would defy logic, bridge worlds, and challenge everything doctors believed about recovery, awareness, and human connection. The monitors beeped steadily, but something was different. Sarah Saunders, kneeling beside her mother's hospital bed, noticed the subtle movements, first a barely perceptible twitch in Emily Saunders' fingers, a shift of her hand across the sheets that hadn't occurred in months. Her heart raced and she leaned closer, watching in disbelief as Liam, the small boy who had wandered into the room by chance, stepped back, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity. He hadn't meant to cause any reaction. All he had done was touch her hand, as he often did with his grandfather when he was sick. Yet now the effects were undeniable. The nurse, Meyer, who had initially scolded him for being in the room, froze, staring at the monitors with her mouth slightly open. She had been a nurse for over 15 years, seen countless comatose patients, and she knew reflexive movements when she saw them, but this felt different. The twitching wasn't random, it seemed responsive, deliberate, and tied to the presence of the boy. Sarah's pulse quickened. "Mom, did you see that?" she whispered urgently, her hand gripping Liam's. He shook his head, uncertain what he had done, and took a cautious step closer to the bed again. Emily's chest rose and fell with the mechanical rhythm of the ventilator. Yet every subtle motion of her hand seemed to synchronize with Liam's actions. Sarah could not contain the surge of hope that threatened to break free after 3 long months of despair. She turned to the nurse, who had quickly pulled over a clipboard, jotting down notes furiously. Emmerer looked up briefly, her professional skepticism battling with what she was witnessing. "It's probably a reflex," she said sharply, but her voice lacked conviction. Sarah ignored her and focused on the monitors. Heart rate slightly elevated, blood pressure minimal fluctuation but notable in context, muscleless occasional contractions subtle but consistent. Each data point seemed to confirm what her eyes were seeing, the first signs that Emily was somehow responding. Liam, unaware of the magnitude of what he was witnessing, tilted his head and repeated the gentle touch on Emily's hand. This time the reaction was stronger. Fingers curled slightly around his small palm, almost as if acknowledging him. Sarah gasped softly, tears forming at the edges of her eyes. "Mom, can you feel him?" she whispered. Liam looked down, his expression a mixture of astonishment and tentative pride. He did not understand why, but he felt a connection to the woman who had been unresponsive for so long. The nurse stepped back, conflicted. She had seen comatose patients respond in various ways, but nothing like this. This was different. There was purpose behind the movement, a clear interaction. Sarah, sensing the potential, gestured to Liam to continue. "Just keep talking to her," she said, her voice low but firm. Liam hesitated, then nodded. He bent slightly, speaking softly, telling her about his morning, about selling candy at the corner, about the pigeons that gathered around the fountain outside, about his grandfather's morning routine. As he spoke, Emily's fingers twitched more deliberately. Her hand moved slightly toward Liam, and a faint pressure was registered as she squeezed his fingers, deliberate and controlled. Sarah felt her heart leap. It was the first conscious response from her mother in 3 months. The nurse called for the attending physician, Dr. Reynolds, who arrived with a brisk pace, his brow furrowed at the commotion. Sarah quickly explained what had happened, pointing to the monitors and the subtle movements. Dr. Reynolds approached the bedside, scrutinizing the equipment, the readings, and the boy. He asked Liam to repeat the gesture. The boy complied, hesitating at first, then gently touched Emily's hand again. This time, the response was more pronounced. Not only did her fingers move, but a faint twitch of her lips hinted at recognition. The monitors showed changes in her heart rhythm, subtle but measurable, and the neurologist's eyes widened with intrigue. "This isn't typical," he muttered, almost to himself. "We need to document everything." Over the next hour, a rhythm developed. Liam, naturally and without any training, interacted with Emily through touch and gentle speech. Each time he spoke or touched her, her body responded in ways that were consistent and meaningful. The doctors and nurses recorded every reaction, meticulously analyzing heart rates, muscle activity, and neurological data. For Sarah, the moment was overwhelming. She had spent months hoping, praying, and imagining her mother's return, but seeing the tangible evidence now, driven by the presence of this extraordinary child, was unlike anything she had expected. Liam, still processing his own emotions, began telling stories, describing his grandfather, his morning routine, and little details of the city outside. Emily's reactions grew stronger with each interaction. Her fingers moved with intent, sometimes curling around Liam's hand, sometimes pressing lightly against his palm in what felt like a deliberate grip. Dr. Reynolds and Meyer observed quietly, exchanging glances that conveyed both skepticism and wonder. The child's touch and voice seemed to unlock something within Emily's brain that months of medical intervention had not. Sarah leaned closer, brushing a strand of hair from Liam's face. "You're helping her more than anyone imagined," she whispered. Liam looked unsure, his wide eyes scanning Emily's still figure, then up at Sarah. "I just touched her," he said softly. "I didn't do anything special," but the effect of his innocent gestures was undeniable. Over the course of the next few minutes, Emily's movements became more consistent. Her fingers flexed, her hand twitched, and there was a subtle change in her facial expression, a gentle lift of the corner of her mouth, as if acknowledging the presence of the boy. Dr. Reynolds instructed the nurse to keep the boy nearby to observe and record every detail. Each touch, each word, and each gesture was now part of a carefully monitored session, creating a pattern of interaction that no one could explain fully. Sarah's mind raced with hope. The woman who had seemed unreachable for so long now showed clear signs of recognition, and it was entirely prompted by a 9-year-old boy's innocent presence. The realization struck her with profound emotion. This simple human connection, born out of curiosity and care, was producing a miraculous outcome that medicine alone had not achieved. Liam, emboldened by the small victories, began interacting more naturally. He held Emily's hand, spoke softly about the pigeons, the candy he sold, and even hummed a tune he had learned from his grandfather. With each interaction, the monitors recorded measurable neurological responses, slight increases in brainwave activity, heart rate shifts, and coordinated movements of fingers and hands. The room seemed to change with every gesture. What had been sterile and clinical now held an air of anticipation, hope, and wonder. Meyer, who had initially resisted the child's presence, now watched in awe, realizing that she was witnessing something truly extraordinary. Dr. Reynolds, ever the scientist, remained analytical but could not deny the data in front of him. The combination of Liam's innocence, empathy, and instinctive care seemed to be stimulating Emily in ways no protocol or treatment plan had achieved. As the session continued, Sarah sat beside Liam, holding his small hand, feeling the connection ripple through the room. Emily's responses became more pronounced, and even a subtle movement of her head suggested recognition of their presence. For the first time in 3 months, hope felt tangible, real, and unstoppable. This day marked the beginning of Emily Saunders' miraculous return to awareness, triggered by an ordinary boy whose heart and curiosity reached across the gap between unconsciousness and life. In that moment, the doctors, the nurses, and the family recognized that something extraordinary had begun, a journey of recovery and human connection that would defy expectations, challenge medical understanding, and restore a mother to her daughter in a way no one could have predicted. After witnessing the first subtle reactions, Sarah Saunders could hardly tear her eyes away from her mother. She sat beside Emily's hospital bed, her fingers intertwined with Liam's small hand, feeling the electric thrill of hope for the first time in months. Each twitch of her mother's fingers, each slight shift in her posture was now a source of fascination and anticipation. Reynolds stood nearby, clipboard in hand, noting every detail with scientific precision, his usual calm demeanor tinged with awe. He had dealt with countless comatose patients over his career, yet he had never seen a situation where a child's mere presence and gentle touch could provoke such a consistent and measurable response. Emma, the head nurse, leaned against the side of the bed, her experienced eyes scanning the monitors. She had learned to balance professionalism with compassion, and in her 20 years of nursing, she had seen miraculous recoveries, but this was different. There was a pattern, a rhythm to Emily's reactions, one that seemed to correspond only to Liam's interactions. Sarah encouraged Liam to speak more softly, to describe his morning, the city streets, the pigeons gathered outside the hospital, and his grandfather's morning routine. As Liam spoke, Emily's fingers flexed with increasing intentionality, sometimes curling around his tiny palm, other times pressing lightly against it, creating a dialogue that was almost tangible. "See that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of disbelief and hope. "Mom is responding. She's listening." Liam, still wide-eyed, nodded slowly, not fully comprehending what was happening. He had always understood that his presence brought comfort to his grandfather, but to affect a stranger, a woman he had never met, and to see her respond, this was new, astonishing, and almost frightening in its significance. Reynolds adjusted his glasses, reviewing the data on the monitors. Heart rate, blood pressure, muscle activity, and slight brainwave shifts all were correlating with Liam's touch and speech. The consistency was remarkable. This was no random reflex, it was a deliberate interaction, a response that suggested awareness. "We need to document everything," Reynolds said finally, his voice steady but filled with urgency. This could represent a breakthrough in understanding consciousness and response in comatose patients. Emma nodded, stepping closer to adjust the equipment. "I'll make sure every gesture, every word, every reaction is recorded," she said. "We've never seen anything like this." Liam, oblivious to the gravity of the moment, continued describing his morning walk, the sounds of traffic, the warmth of the sun on his face, and the people he had met. Emily's fingers twitched again, curling around his hand, then releasing lightly, a small but deliberate motion. Sarah squeezed his hand gently. "She recognizes you, Liam. She knows you're here," she whispered. Liam looked down at his hand, then up at Emily, his expression a mixture of pride and concern. He had never been the center of attention in this way, and he was unsure how to react. "I just wanted to say hi," he murmured. Sarah smiled, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "You've done more than say hi. You've helped her wake up in ways no one else could." As the minutes stretched into hours, a rhythm formed between Emily and Liam. Sarah sat beside them, narrating her own observations, noting every subtle movement, the slight tilt of Emily's head when Liam spoke, the gentle curl of her fingers in response to his touch, the minor changes in her breathing patterns that suggested engagement. Reynolds and Emma moved carefully around the room, occasionally taking readings, making notes, and comparing data. They maintained a balance between observation and intervention, understanding that any disruption could affect the fragile connection forming in front of them. Liam began to experiment, adjusting his voice, speaking louder or softer, sometimes moving his fingers along Emily's hand or gently tapping her arm, and each variation produced measurable responses. It was as if he was learning intuitively how to communicate with her, unlocking a part of her mind that had been inaccessible for months. Sarah could feel the emotional weight of the moment pressing down on her. She had been prepared to mourn her mother in stages, accepting each small deterioration with stoic resignation. But now she witnessed a reversal, a spark of life emerging, the touch and voice of a child. It was impossible to ignore. Emma, standing near the monitors, shook her head slightly in disbelief. "It's as if she's responding to his presence specifically," she said quietly. "I've never seen this before. Not with patients, we've tried music therapy, not with family visits, nothing." Reynolds stepped closer, squinting at the screens, adjusting electrodes and making careful calculations. "We need to keep a controlled record," he said, thinking ahead to research possibilities, case studies, and peer consultations. "If this continues, it could change everything we know about coma recovery and the potential for non-medical stimuli to trigger neurological responses." Liam, unaware of the technical terms or scientific significance, simply continued being himself. He narrated small details of his life, recounted a minor argument with a street vendor over a candy price, described a bird hopping along the sidewalk or the sunlight reflecting off a puddle. Each observation produced a response from Emily, her hand curling slightly, a finger twitching, a subtle lift of her lips, a shift in eye muscle. Sarah noticed that Emily's reactions grew stronger with each repetition, reinforcing the connection between the boy's presence and her mother's awakening. Over time, the hospital staff began to approach the situation with a mixture of caution and admiration. Doctors consulted, nurses took turns observing, and Sarah remained vigilant at her mother's bedside. The bond between Liam and Emily was undeniable, unique, and seemingly instantaneous. It transcended age, background, and the barriers imposed by the coma. It was a purely human connection, fragile yet powerful, that brought life back to a body and mind that had been unreachable. Reynolds decided to formalize the sessions. Liam would interact under observation, his words, gestures, and presence recorded in detail. Each session provided new insights, reinforcing the understanding that Emily was not only perceiving the world but responding deliberately to stimuli she recognized. Sarah, witnessing the miracle unfold, felt a renewed sense of purpose. She supported Liam, encouraged him to continue speaking, and documented emotional reactions that were impossible to measure scientifically but were undeniable in their impact. Emily's movements became more coordinated over time. Her fingers could now follow Liam's direction intentionally, her facial expressions reflected recognition, and her heart responded measurably to his voice. What had started as a single touch evolved into an interactive process, a conversation without words, a bridge between life and consciousness built entirely on human empathy. In those hours, the hospital room became a place of quiet astonishment. The mechanical beeping of monitors was no longer sterile, it was part of a rhythm, a heartbeat of hope and connection. Doctors discussed the potential implications for future therapy, nurses marveled at the power of genuine human interaction, and Sarah and Liam remained central to the miracle unfolding. Emily Saunders, after months of medical stasis, was beginning to awaken not through medication or surgery, but through the care, attention, and gentle guidance of a 9-year-old boy who had wandered into her room by accident. The connection was extraordinary, fragile, and unexplainable, yet profoundly real. Each small movement, each subtle acknowledgement was a victory, a step toward reclaiming the life that had been paused for far too long. It was clear to everyone present that the relationship forming between Liam and Emily was more than coincidences. It was a catalyst for recovery, a spark that had reignited the dormant potential of the human mind. Days passed since Liam's first unexpected interaction with Emily Saunders, and each session seemed to bring new surprises. The subtle twitches and finger curls that had initially startled Sarah and the medical team began to grow more pronounced. Emily's hands, once motionless for months, now followed deliberate patterns in response to Liam's gentle guidance. It was as if she were learning to reestablish a language long lost, a communication channel opened by the pure simplicity of a child's presence. Reynolds monitored the readings with increasing intensity, noting changes in heart rate, blood pressure, and even brainwave patterns that seemed to synchronize with Liam's storytelling. "This is unprecedented," he murmured to Emire as they watched the monitors together. "Every touch, every word he says elicits a measurable neurological response. We have to keep detailed records. This could redefine what we know about sensory stimulation in comatose patients." Emmer nodded, adjusting the electrodes with precise care. She had never witnessed such consistent pattern of response. Even her years of experience could not account for the clarity of Emily's reactions. For her, the human aspect, the connection between the child and patient, was just as crucial as the clinical data on the monitors. Liam, for his part, began to notice the effect he had. At first, he had been cautious, unsure of how to interact. Now, he spoke with confidence, narrating small stories about his grandfather, the streets of Brooklyn, and his day-to-day adventures selling candy. Each detail seemed to elicit a more significant response from Emily. Her fingers moved in coordination with his words, occasionally curling to gently touch his hand, and at times, her subtle shift suggested recognition of him rather than just a physical reflex. Sarah watched closely, documenting every gesture and verbal exchange. She could see the excitement in Liam's eyes, the same mix of wonder and responsibility that had grown in him through his life on the streets and the care he provided for his grandfather. He had become the bridge between her mother and the world, a catalyst for recovery that defied logic and medical convention. One afternoon, as Liam described a particularly amusing incident with a delivery driver who had refused to buy a candy bar for less than $1, Emily's fingers not only twitched but gripped his hand firmly for a brief moment. Sarah gasped softly. Mom just responded intentionally, she whispered, her voice full of awe. Reynolds leaned in, reviewing the data. Her grip is deliberate, he said. This isn't random. She's engaging with him cognitively. Meyer adjusted the monitoring equipment to ensure every detail was captured. This is extraordinary, she said quietly. The consistency of her reactions is something I've never documented before. The following sessions revealed a pattern that seemed to strengthen with repetition. Liam discovered that subtle changes in his tone of voice, the speed at which he spoke, and even the choice of words influenced the intensity of Emily's responses. If he spoke softly and slowly, her hand would reach out and curl gently around his, her fingers forming a conscious connection. If he laughed or hummed a tune, her fingers flexed and her chest rose with deeper breaths, signaling a physiological response that indicated engagement rather than a simple reflex. Sarah observed these developments with amazement. She had long known her mother as a woman of intelligence and strength, and seeing that part of her mind still alive, capable of perceiving and responding, filled her with hope she hadn't felt in months. She's getting stronger, Sarah whispered to Meyer. Every day I feel like she's learning how to be present again. Meyer nodded, her experienced eyes scanning the monitors. It's like watching a plant bloom after a harsh winter, she said. Slowly but undeniably, life is returning. Emily's reactions began to extend beyond her hands. Slight movements of her wrists, subtle lifts of her arms, and tiny contractions in her facial muscles suggested recognition and cognitive processing. The medical team started recording these reactions in structured sessions, noting the exact time, stimulus, and response. Each session lasted longer, with Emily demonstrating increasing endurance in her interactions. The data collected was unlike anything Reynolds had ever seen. There was a measurable correlation between Liam's presence and Emily's neurological responses. Heart rate variability indicated alertness and engagement, while EEG readings showed spikes in activity when Liam spoke or touched her hand. Sarah realized that Liam had become an unwitting therapist, using empathy and curiosity rather than medical instruments to stimulate her mother's recovery. The consistency was remarkable. Each day, Liam seemed to intuitively adjust his approach, guided by the subtle feedback he received from Emily's movements. He learned to slow his speech, emphasize certain words, and focus on stories that seemed to resonate most. The bond between them strengthened with each session, creating an unspoken dialogue built on trust, recognition, and compassion. Emily, once thought to be unreachable, was becoming more present, more connected. Her fingers could now follow basic instructions when Liam prompted them, curling or releasing on command. Her eyes, previously closed in a fixed position, began to flutter slightly, tracking Liam's movements as he leaned in or moved around her bed. Sarah's hope grew with every session. She began imagining what it would be like to see her mother fully aware again, to hear her speak, to share ordinary moments together that had been stolen by the accident. For Dr. Reynolds, the situation presented both a challenge and an opportunity. He had spent decades relying on medical interventions, therapies, and procedures. But here was evidence that a child's simple presence and emotional connection could produce quantifiable neurological responses in a patient who had been unresponsive for months. This could redefine coma therapy, he said quietly to Meyer one afternoon. We may need to consider how emotional and social stimuli can affect neurological recovery. Era nodded, her mind racing with implications. She had always understood that human touch and emotional presence were important, but seeing it have such a profound effect was both humbling and exhilarating. Emily's improvements continued steadily. Her hands moved more fluidly, her fingers followed Liam's guidance with greater accuracy, and subtle expressions began to form on her face, hinting at recognition and awareness. Sarah and the medical team documented every detail, noting that even minor changes in posture, breathing, and muscle tension were signs of emerging consciousness. Liam, growing more confident, began experimenting with new ways to interact. He told longer stories, described the world outside in more detail, and even hummed songs that his grandfather had taught him. Each interaction produced stronger and more consistent responses from Emily. It was clear that she was not only reacting physically but processing his presence cognitively, a sign that the dormant connections in her brain were beginning to awaken. By the end of the week, the cumulative effect was undeniable. Emily's body was responding with increasing strength and coordination. Her hands could follow Liam's gestures more deliberately, and the small contractions of her facial muscles suggested recognition and emotional engagement. Sarah held Liam's hand, tears brimming in her eyes. "Mom is coming back," she said softly. "Every day she's getting stronger, and it's all because of you." Liam looked at her, a mixture of pride and humility in his gaze. He had only wanted to help, to be kind, and yet his actions were producing results that no one could have predicted. The room, once a sterile medical environment, now felt alive with possibility, hope, and the quiet wonder of human connection. Emily Saunders, once unreachable and unresponsive, was beginning to reclaim her life. guided by the intuitive empathy of a 9-year-old boy who'd wandered into her hospital room by chance. It was a slow, delicate process, but each small victory, each deliberate twitch, each gripping of a hand, each subtle shift in expression marked a step toward full recovery, fueled by trust, love, and the extraordinary power of human connection. After witnessing Emily Saunders' remarkable responses to Liam's presence, Reynolds and the hospital team realized that a structured approach could maximize her recovery. The initial interactions had been spontaneous, almost accidental, but the consistency and intensity of Emily's reactions suggested that deliberate sessions might yield even more significant progress. Dr. Reynolds called a meeting with Sarah and the nursing team to discuss a plan. He explained the importance of documenting every interaction, establishing a schedule, and ensuring that Liam's presence could be safely integrated into Emily's care routine. Sarah listened intently, her heart racing with hope and a touch of anxiety. The thought of formalizing Liam's involvement was daunting but necessary. She wanted her mother to recover fully, and if that meant creating a routine around the boy's visits, she was willing to commit. Mara, the head nurse, contributed practical considerations. She emphasized the need to maintain hospital protocols, protect Emily from infection, and create an environment where Liam could interact naturally without being overwhelmed. She suggested short, frequent sessions initially, gradually increasing their duration as Emily's stamina improved. Liam's mother, Margaret, was brought into the conversation. She was cautious at first, concerned about the risks of exposing her son to a hospital environment and the emotional weight of interacting with a severely ill patient. Yet after observing the impact her son had on Emily and listening to Dr. Reynolds' explanation, she began to understand that Liam was not just visiting casually. He was participating in a therapeutic process that could genuinely help save a life. Margaret agreed under the condition that Liam's school and family responsibilities would remain intact. The team established a clear schedule. Liam would arrive each morning before school, spend time interacting with Emily under supervision, and then return home to continue his daily routine. Sarah would be present for every session, both to monitor Emily and to support Liam. The first officially scheduled session began with careful preparation. Liam entered the room with his small backpack, his eyes bright with curiosity and a sense of responsibility. Sarah and Emily greeted him warmly, reminding him that his presence mattered, but that he should remain calm and gentle. Emily lay on the bed, her monitors tracking every heartbeat, every muscle contraction, every subtle neurological signal. Liam approached cautiously, placing his hand near hers. The familiar touch immediately triggered a response as her fingers twitched, curling slightly around his hand, as if welcoming him back. The room felt alive with possibility. Dr. Reynolds observed the monitors closely, recording baseline data before the interaction and noting the physiological changes as the session progressed. Liam began speaking softly, narrating the story of his morning walk, the people he had met, and even a small mishap with a candy sale. Emily responded with consistent movements, and for the first time, a slight lift of her lips suggested recognition and engagement. The doctors and nurses were meticulous, but they also allowed the interactions to remain natural, understanding that the spontaneity of the connection was essential. Sarah documented every reaction in her notebook, the time of each twitch, the duration of the grip, the subtle changes in facial expression. These notes became critical not just for tracking Emily's progress, but for understanding the precise ways in which Liam's presence influenced her neurological activity. Over the following days, the routine became ingrained. Liam arrived each morning, enthusiastic yet focused, prepared to engage with Emily through stories, soft conversation, and gentle touch. Sarah ensured that he felt supported, encouraging him when he was unsure and reminding him of the extraordinary impact he was having. Anira adjusted monitors and recorded data, ensuring that the sessions were safe and productive. Dr. Reynolds analyzed patterns, noting correlations between specific stimuli and Emily's responses. Sometimes Liam would hum a tune, and her fingers would curl rhythmically. Sometimes he would describe a humorous street encounter, and a faint smile would appear on her lips. Each interaction revealed new possibilities, and the medical team began to understand the profound role emotional connection played in neurological recovery. Emily's responses became increasingly coordinated over time. She began to follow Liam's instructions more deliberately, moving her fingers or hand according to his gentle guidance. Her heart rate responded positively to his voice, indicating increased engagement and perhaps even recognition. Sarah marveled at each session, recording the progression and sharing observations with the doctors. Liam, growing more confident, began to take an active role in the sessions, learning intuitively which stories, tones, and touches elicited the strongest reactions. He became more aware of Emily's subtle cues, adjusting his approach with the natural instinct of someone who had learned to care for another person with patience and attention. Margaret observed from the doorway, her initial apprehension replaced by pride and admiration. She had always known Liam was special, responsible, and compassionate, but seeing him actively contribute to saving a life elevated her appreciation for her son to a new level. The hospital staff, initially skeptical, began to embrace the structured sessions. They saw firsthand that Emily's neurological responses were real, consistent, and growing stronger each day. Reynolds began documenting the sessions as a formal study, noting that the child's presence had triggered measurable neurological and physiological improvements in a patient who had been unresponsive for months. Each session brought new hope. Sarah observed that Emily's fingers could now follow more complex directions, and her subtle facial movements suggested recognition of Liam as a distinct individual. Heart rate, blood pressure, and even minor brainwave activity displayed changes correlated with his presence. Meyer remarked that this was unlike any coma patient she had ever observed. Emily was not only responding physically but emotionally, demonstrating the profound influence of genuine human connection. The sessions became a cornerstone of Emily's daily routine. Liam, Sarah, and the medical team worked together seamlessly, creating a consistent, predictable environment in which Emily could safely and steadily progress. Sarah's documentation became a crucial reference for future sessions, helping to identify which stimuli were most effective. Liam's confidence continued to grow. He became a quiet teacher, guiding Emily's small movements, narrating the world outside, and providing emotional support that bridged the gap between unconsciousness and awareness. Emily's neurological development accelerated in response, demonstrating that the right combination of empathy, attention, and consistency could achieve results that medical interventions alone had not. Over the weeks, the pattern became unmistakable. Emily's movements were more deliberate, her awareness more apparent, and her responses increasingly consistent. The medical team had observed enough to conclude that Liam's presence was not merely comforting, it was therapeutic. They began to explore ways to replicate this effect in controlled settings, recognizing the potential implications for coma therapy and rehabilitation more broadly. Sarah felt a deep sense of gratitude and responsibility. She had witnessed her mother's first signs of life return, and she now played an active role in ensuring that every session was meaningful, safe, and productive. Liam's courage, empathy, and natural ability to connect with Emily had created a framework that could be studied, understood, and potentially applied to other patients. What began as a chance encounter had evolved into a structured, deliberate therapy with Sarah, Liam, and the medical team working in harmony to foster Emily's recovery. Every morning brought new evidence that hope was not only possible, it was tangible, measurable, and growing stronger with each interaction. Emily Saunders, once trapped in a state of unresponsiveness, was reclaiming her life through the extraordinary connection between a child and his patient, guided by empathy, consistency, and the unwavering dedication of a family determined to bring her back. Weeks into the structured sessions, the team began to notice significant improvements in Emily Saunders' responsiveness. It started subtly at first. Her fingers followed Liam's direction more consistently, and the slight movements of her hands became more purposeful. Sarah recorded each instance, her notebook filling with detailed observations, the time, duration, and quality of Emily's responses. Every small victory was celebrated quietly, though the weight of months of worry made each one feel monumental. Liam had grown comfortable in his role. At first, he had been hesitant, unsure of how to approach a patient who had been unresponsive for months. Now he moved with confidence, gently placing his hand near Emily's, narrating stories, humming tunes, and observing the subtle cues that guided his interactions. The relationship between child and patient had transformed into a delicate dialogue, one based entirely on trust, empathy, and intuitive understanding. One morning, Liam arrived carrying a small sketchbook. He had drawn pictures for Emily's, simple illustrations of birds, street corners, and scenes from his daily life. Placing the book on the bedside table, he opened it and began explaining the drawings in his soft, deliberate voice. Emily's hand twitched toward the sketches, her fingers following the outlines as if she were tracing the shapes. Sarah leaned in, her eyes brimming with tears. "Mom is engaging," she whispered to Meyer, who was observing from across the room. Era nodded, taking careful notes. "Look at her hand movements," she said. "They recoordinated. This isn't reflex. She's processing and responding to." Reynolds, who had joined the session late, approached the bedside, adjusting his glasses as he reviewed the monitors. Heart rate variability, blood pressure fluctuations, and even subtle brainwave patterns indicated active engagement. "The correlation is undeniable," he said. "She's responding to stimuli in a way we've never documented before." Over the next few days, Emily's responses became even more pronounced. Her fingers could follow Liam's instructions, her hand would grasp his gently when he prompted her, and her facial expressions began to reflect recognition. Sarah noticed a small smile forming when Liam recounted a particularly funny story about a street dog he had seen chasing pigeons. It was a fleeting expression, but its presence sent a ripple of hope through everyone in the room. The team realized that Emily was not only responding physically but emotionally. Her heart rate would subtly increase when Liam spoke. Her fingers would flex more deliberately when he reached for them, and occasional micro-expressions suggested recognition of the boy as an individual rather than a generic stimulus. Sarah observed that the consistency of these reactions grew stronger with repetition. The more structured and predictable the sessions, the more Emily seemed to respond. It became clear that the rhythm, tone, and content of Liam's interactions were integral to her progress. Liam, for his part, began experimenting. He hummed different tunes, varied his speech, and tried storytelling with varying emotions, observing the subtle changes in Emily's response. If he narrated a humorous incident, her fingers would curl in a playful grasp. If he told a story with a softer, comforting tone, her hand would rest more fully in his, a delicate acknowledgement of presence. The team documented everything meticulously, understanding that these sessions were as much scientific observation as they were therapeutic intervention. NR and Reynolds worked together to track physiological changes, noting every micro-reaction, every spike in neurological activity. They began to discuss the possibility of using these interactions to develop a broader approach to coma therapy, emphasizing emotional engagement and human connection. Sarah remained an active participant, providing insight into Liam's intuitiveness and offering emotional support to both mother and child. She encouraged Liam to continue engaging naturally with Emily, observing how small adjustments in tone or gesture could provoke more pronounced responses. One afternoon, during a particularly extended session, Emily's eyes fluttered slightly, following Liam's hand as he moved over the sketches. Her fingers flexed and curled around his hand, holding for several seconds in a deliberate motion. Sarah gasped softly, barely daring to breathe. Reynolds stepped closer, his eyes scanning the monitors and recording the precise timing of each movement. "We were seeing clear signs of conscious engagement," he said. "This level of responsiveness is extraordinary." Mayer adjusted the monitors to capture the session fully, noting each physiological change and subtle reaction. Emily's slight eye movements, coordinated hand gestures, and changes in heart rate all pointed toward an emerging awareness. Liam, oblivious to the scientific significance, continued narrating his morning adventures, describing the sun reflecting off the puddles, the birds hopping along the streets, and his encounters with neighbors. His words flowed naturally, filled with innocence and empathy. Emily responded consistently, her hands following the rhythm of his voice, her fingers curling around his in recognition. The emotional impact was equally profound. Sarah saw the expressions on Liam's face: pride, excitement, and a quiet understanding of the importance of his role. She saw Emily, once unresponsive, showing subtle signs of awareness, a connection forming that transcended words. The room became a place of quiet anticipation, every small movement celebrated as a victory. With each session, Emily's endurance improved. She could maintain coordinated hand movements for longer periods, her attention appeared sustained, and her facial expressions became more varied. Even brief moments of recognition, slight smiles, gentle finger squeezes provided evidence that her cognitive and emotional faculties were recovering. Sarah began to document patterns, noting which types of stimuli produced the strongest reactions. Liam's voice, storytelling style, and choice of content all had measurable effects on Emily's responses. The structured sessions were proving to be a powerful therapeutic tool, one that combined scientific observation with the natural empathy and intuition of a child. Emily's gradual improvements extended beyond motor responses. Her subtle facial expressions hinted at emotional processing, and her heart rate changes suggested engagement with the world around her. Liam's presence was clearly a catalyst, and the team recognized the potential for this approach to be applied in broader therapeutic contexts. As the days turned into weeks, Emily's responsiveness became more predictable. She could follow instructions from Liam, maintain brief interactions, and respond to stories with coordinated hand and finger movements. Her progress inspired renewed hope for a full recovery, demonstrating that emotional connection, empathy, and consistent interaction could play a critical role in awakening patients from prolonged unresponsiveness. Sarah Meyer and Dr. Reynolds continued refining the sessions, combining clinical observation with the natural rapport between Liam and Emily. The structured approach allowed for measurable progress while preserving the intuitive, compassionate nature of the interactions. Each session became a milestone, a step toward reclaiming Emily's life. Liam, growing more confident, continued to explore new ways to engage her, his natural empathy guiding him instinctively. Emily, responding to his presence, demonstrated that the human brain, even in prolonged unresponsiveness, could awaken when met with genuine care and attention. The early improvements, though subtle, marked a turning point in her recovery. The emotional responses, smiles, gentle grips, eye movements provided tangible evidence that Emily was reconnecting with the world, with her family, and with life itself. It was clear to everyone in the room, the miracle that had begun with a child's simple presence was unfolding into something extraordinary, a combination of science, empathy, and human connection that had the potential to change everything they thought they knew about recovery. As the structured sessions continued, Emily Saunders' neurological responses became increasingly clear and deliberate. The subtle movements that had once been fleeting twitches now exhibited coordination and intention. Sarah sat by her mother's bedside, carefully documenting each gesture while marveling at the progress. Emily's fingers, previously only capable of small, reflexive movements, now followed Liam's guidance with precision, curling around his small palm when he prompted and releasing on command. Each interaction was more than a mechanical response, and it carried a weight of recognition and awareness that had been absent for months. Reynolds observed the monitors with a mixture of professional curiosity and cautious optimism. Heart rate variability, subtle changes in blood pressure, and measurable shifts in brainwave patterns confirmed that Emily's mind was actively processing the stimuli provided by Liam. The correlation was undeniable. Her neurological responses are accelerating, Dr. Reynolds said quietly to Emily. We were seeing intentional movement, not reflex. This is exactly what we've been hoping for, but at a scale we didn't anticipate. Ended, her eyes fixed on Emily. She had decades of experience in neurological care, yet witnessing such clear, consistent responses to a child's presence was unprecedented. Sarah glanced at Liam, who was sitting beside the bed with a focused, almost reverent expression. He had become attuned to his mother's subtle cues, intuitively understanding when to slow his speech, when to gesture, and when to pause. His storytelling had evolved into a natural form of therapy, each word and movement eliciting responses that reflected both cognitive awareness and emotional engagement. Emily's eyes, previously half-lidded and unreactive, now flickered with recognition. On several occasions, her gaze followed Liam as he moved around the room, suggesting emerging visual tracking and attention. Sarah's heart swelled as she recorded these signs. "Mom, can you see him?" she whispered, her voice barely above the hum of the monitors. Emily's slight tilt of the head seemed to answer, a delicate acknowledgement that sent a wave of hope through the room. Reynolds approached, noting the improvements meticulously. The combination of consistent emotional stimulus and cognitive engagement is producing measurable neuroplastic changes, he said. Her brain is reorganizing and responding in ways we rarely observe in patients after prolonged unresponsiveness. Emily adjusted the monitoring equipment, ensuring every subtle reaction was captured. The hospital staff began to treat the sessions as both therapeutic intervention and clinical observation, understanding that the data gathered could have broader implications for coma recovery. Liam, growing more confident in his role, began experimenting with different methods of interaction. He would narrate detailed stories from his morning walks, describe city scenes, or even recount playful interactions with neighbors and animals. Each story elicited unique responses from Emily. When he described humorous incidents, her fingers flexed in coordinated movements. When he spoke softly about calming experiences, her hand rested more fully in his grasp. Her facial expressions became more varied, occasionally showing brief smiles or shifts in emotion that reflected recognition and engagement. Sarah observed that the strength and consistency of Emily's responses seemed to increase with repetition. Each session built upon the last, creating a cumulative effect that indicated not only physical responsiveness but also cognitive awareness. Reynolds noted that Emily's increasing ability to follow instructions, maintain focus on Liam, and respond to emotional cues suggested that her consciousness was gradually remerging. The team began to place genuine hope in her recovery, acknowledging the extraordinary role that Liam's presence had played. On one afternoon, during an extended session, Emily's hand moved deliberately to grasp Liam's small wrist, holding it for several seconds with steady pressure. Sarah leaned closer, holding her breath as she observed the interaction. "She's choosing to respond," she whispered to Emily. Emma nodded, her experienced eyes reflecting both amazement and cautious optimism. "This level of engagement is significant," she said. "We're witnessing intentionality in her movements. Her brain is clearly processing, recognizing, and responding to stimuli." Reynolds adjusted the EEG monitors and reviewed the data on the screens. Spikes in brain activity coincided precisely with Liam's gestures and storytelling. "These readings confirm it," he said. "Emily is showing clear evidence of conscious engagement. We can begin to plan for the next stages of rehabilitation with real hope that she will continue to improve." Emily's physical improvements were matched by emotional responses that became increasingly apparent. When Liam hummed a familiar tune or recounted personal stories, her fingers moved to meet his hand, her chest shifted with deeper, more intentional breaths. and her slight facial expressions suggested recognition and engagement. Sarah observed that these reactions were not random. They were consistent and aligned with specific stimuli, creating a pattern that clearly indicated the presence of awareness. The structured sessions were now critical to Emily's progress. Liam's presence, combined with the careful monitoring and guidance of Sarah and the medical team, created an environment where Emily could safely and steadily rebuild neural pathways that had been dormant. Each interaction reinforced cognitive connections, strengthening both her motor skills and her emerging consciousness. Over several weeks, the improvements became more pronounced. Emily could follow more complex instructions from Liam, coordinate her hand movements with greater accuracy, and demonstrate subtle emotional reactions, such as brief smiles or slight shifts in attention. The team observed that repeated interactions produced stronger responses, suggesting the formation of memory and the reinforcement of neural pathways. Reynolds began to formalize the observations into a case study, noting the extraordinary influence of emotional and social stimuli on coma recovery. He hypothesized that Emily's cognitive awakening was being accelerated by a combination of consistent interaction, empathy, and genuine human connection provided by Liam. Sarah continued documenting everything in meticulous detail. She recorded every gesture, finger movement, and facial expression, noting correlations with specific stories, tones of voice, or touches. Her notes became an essential resource for the medical team, helping refine session strategies and track progress accurately. Liam, still a child in so many ways, grew more attuned to Emily's subtle cues. He learned which stories elicited stronger responses, how to modulate his tone for engagement, and how to respond to the faintest movements of her hands or slight eye flickers. His natural empathy, patience, and observation skills had become the cornerstone of Emily's recovery. One afternoon, as Liam described a bright sunny day at the park, Emily's fingers grasped his hand and held it firmly, her chest rising with steady breaths, and a subtle lift at the corner of her lips suggested recognition. Sarah gasped, overwhelmed with emotion. "Mom, you're really here," she whispered. Gerda Reynolds reviewed the EEG data and the monitor's readings. "This is a profound breakthrough," he said softly. "We are no longer observing reflexes. Emily is responding with awareness. We can now plan the next stages of active rehabilitation with genuine hope." Emily, standing by the bedside, smiled, her eyes reflecting a combination of professional satisfaction and personal wonder. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in months, hope was no longer tentative. Emily Saunders was responding intentionally, cognitively, and emotionally. The miracle that had begun with a child wandering into her hospital room was unfolding into a tangible path toward recovery, guided by human connection, empathy, and the extraordinary resilience of the mind. Every small movement, every deliberate gesture, every subtle recognition confirmed that Emily's consciousness was returning. The team's confidence grew, and for the first time, they allowed themselves to envision a full recovery. As Emily Saunders' neurological responses grew stronger, her emotional reactions began to follow. Sarah noticed the subtle but unmistakable changes, first a flicker in her mother's eyes when she entered the room, a slight curling of her fingers as she held Liam's hand, and the faintest hint of a smile when familiar voices spoke. These gestures, small as they were, spoke volumes. For months, Sarah had kept hope alive in private, fearing disappointment, but now she could see her mother reacting to the people she loved most. The hospital room, once dominated by the hum of machines and the sterile smell of antiseptic, now felt charged with a quiet, powerful energy. Liam, sitting beside Emily, seemed to sense the changes too. He spoke softly, narrating small stories about his day, about the birds that perched outside the window, about the corner where he sold candy each morning. Emily's eyes followed him with increasing focus, her fingers curling around his in acknowledgement. Sarah could see recognition in her mother's movements. The connection was no longer just physical, it was emotional. Emily seemed to understand the presence of her daughter and the boy who had become her unexpected therapist. Gerda Reynolds monitored the data carefully. Heart rate variability and subtle brainwave changes suggested that Emily was processing the presence of loved ones, responding not just to stimuli but to the emotional significance of those around her. Emily, the head nurse, observed with a mix of professional curiosity and personal wonder. "We were seeing cognitive recognition combined with emotional engagement," she noted quietly to Gerda Reynolds. Her reactions are no longer purely mechanical, they reflect awareness of people she knows. Sarah leaned closer to Emily, her own voice trembling with emotion. "Mom, it's me, Sarah. I've been here every day." "Liam's here too." Emily's eyes followed her words, flicking first to Sarah, then to Liam. Her fingers flexed deliberately, reaching for Sarah's hand and holding it gently. Then, with a small motion, she allowed Liam to place his hand atop hers. The three of them sat in a quiet tableau, connected through touch, sight, and shared recognition. For the first time, Sarah felt an unspoken affirmation that her mother knew she was there and understood their presence. Liam's face lit up with a mixture of pride and awe. He had only wanted to help, never imagining that he would awaken such recognition. Now he saw the tangible impact of his care. Each session became richer as Emily's awareness deepened. Her movements became more coordinated, her hand gestures more deliberate, and the subtle changes in her facial expressions began to reflect emotion: brief smiles, tiny twitches of the lips, and slight lifts of the eyebrows in recognition. Sarah documented everything, noting the precise timing of each response, the context, and the apparent emotional significance. Reynolds suggested slight modifications to the sessions, emphasizing extended periods of engagement, incorporating familiar stories, and allowing for moments of quiet observation, all designed to reinforce recognition and emotional connection. Emily's responses grew stronger over successive sessions. When Sarah spoke directly to her mother, calling her by name and referencing shared experiences, Emily's hand would reach toward hers, maintaining gentle pressure, and her eyes would track every movement. Liam observed these changes and adjusted his storytelling accordingly, speaking in a soft, deliberate tone and emphasizing details that had previously elicited the strongest responses. Over time, Emily began to initiate subtle gestures herself. Her fingers would curl around Liam's hand without prompting, and occasionally she would attempt to lift her head slightly, tilting towards Sarah. These actions marked a profound shift. Emily was no longer a passive recipient of stimuli, but an active participant in her own recovery. Sarah and the medical team recognized this as a major milestone. "She's initiating movement now," Reynolds said, reviewing the monitors. "This shows intention, awareness, and emerging agency. Her mind is reconnecting with her body and her surroundings." Emma adjusted the monitoring equipment, noting increases in heart rate and subtle EEG changes corresponding with these voluntary movements. The consistency of Emily's responses reinforced the growing understanding that emotional connection, specifically with loved ones, was a powerful catalyst for neurological recovery. One afternoon, Sarah held Emily's hand while Liam described a neighborhood event with exaggerated gestures and enthusiasm. Emily's fingers flexed, curling around each of theirs in turn. Her chest rose more fully with each breath, her lips lifted in a faint but genuine smile, and her eyes followed Liam's movements. Sarah felt tears welling up. "Mom, you see him, you see us," she whispered. Emily's small, deliberate motions affirmed this, holding both of their hands simultaneously for several seconds, a tangible expression of recognition and connection. The family dynamic within the hospital room transformed. Emily's awareness allowed her to respond emotionally to both Sarah and Liam, strengthening bonds that had been strained by months of separation and uncertainty. The hospital staff observed this transformation with fascination. Reynolds noted that Emily's increased engagement correlated with improvements in both motor function and emotional responsiveness. Era remarked on the power of the bond between patient and child, noting that the emotional significance of Liam's presence seemed to enhance the efficacy of the sessions. The improvement was not limited to brief gestures. Over days and weeks, Emily's responses became more sustained. Her hands could maintain gentle pressure for longer periods, her fingers followed sequential movements directed by Liam, and her eyes tracked the subtle movements of both Sarah and Liam. Occasional microexpressions, a slight raise of an eyebrow, a tiny tilt of the head, or a gentle squeeze of their hands suggested both recognition and emotional engagement. Sarah began to notice subtle changes in Emily's breathing and posture. When Liam spoke enthusiastically, her chest expanded with deliberate breaths, indicating alertness and attention. When she heard comforting words from Sarah, her posture relaxed slightly, suggesting recognition of familiar, supportive voices. The team began to incorporate these observations into therapy sessions. Reynolds adjusted the frequency and duration, emphasizing consistency while allowing space for Emily's developing agency. Emma helped ensure that Liam's involvement remained structured yet natural, preserving the authenticity of the interactions. The combined approach, structured guidance, emotional engagement, and continuous observation yielded remarkable results. Emily's neurological and emotional responses strengthened in tandem. She began to communicate through small gestures, coordinated movements, and facial expressions that reflected both recognition and emotional connection. Sarah, holding her mother's hand, could feel the presence of awareness that had been absent for months. Liam, too, experienced the impact of these connections firsthand. His stories, gestures, and gentle presence were not only helping Emily reconnect with the world, but also restoring a sense of purpose and pride in himself. The hospital room became a space of hope, connection, and quiet triumph. Every gesture, every deliberate movement, every subtle acknowledgement reinforced the bonds between Emily, Sarah, and Liam. The family had been through months of uncertainty and fear, and now, with Emily's responses growing stronger, They experienced a profound sense of reunion and shared resilience. Jutta Reynolds and Emily recognized that these developments represented a turning point. Emily's increasing awareness and emotional responsiveness were tangible proof that recovery was not only possible but actively unfolding. The combination of structured therapy, human connection, and consistent engagement had created an environment where the mind could awaken, body and soul reconnecting through the love and care of those closest to her. For the first time in months, the family allowed themselves to believe fully in the possibility of a return to life, to communication, and to the shared moments that had been postponed by tragedy. Emily Saunders' journey of recovery, initiated by a child's curiosity and nurtured by deliberate care and emotional connection, had begun to flourish in profound and measurable ways. As the weeks passed, Emily Saunders' recovery continued at a pace that astonished her family and medical team. What had begun as subtle twitches and micro-expressions gradually transformed into deliberate gestures and intentional movements. Each session revealed more about her emerging awareness and the way she was beginning to interact with her environment. Sarah observed closely as Emily started to communicate with deliberate hand movements, pressing lightly when she wanted to signal attention or curling her fingers around theirs to indicate recognition. It was as though she had developed a personal language, one built on touch and motion, through which she could express awareness, emotion, and connection. Liam became increasingly attuned to Emily's cues. He learned to interpret the faintest shifts in her fingers, the way her hand rested in his, and even the subtle changes in her breathing that preceded a deliberate gesture. With every interaction, their bond strengthened, evolving into a seamless communication that transcended words. Emily would reach toward Liam first now, curling her hand around his fingers in recognition before any prompt was given. Her gaze followed him with purpose, tracking his movements across the room. And at times she would blink slowly in response to his speech as though acknowledging his presence with understanding. Sarah watched in awe as her mother began to initiate interactions independently. For the first time in months, Emily was not merely responding to external stimuli, she was reaching out intentionally, choosing when and how to communicate. A small tilt of her head, a deliberate squeeze of Liam's hand, and a coordinated movement of her fingers formed a pattern that conveyed meaning. Jutta Reynolds and Emily continued their detailed monitoring. They recorded heart rate fluctuations, EEG patterns, and muscle activity, noting that each deliberate gesture corresponded to measurable neurological responses. Her actions are intentional, not reflexive, Jutta Reynolds noted, reviewing the latest data. We were seeing voluntary motor control coupled with cognitive recognition. This is a pivotal moment in her recovery. Anna adjusted the monitors and carefully observed Emily's movements. Her awareness is becoming more apparent, she said. She's initiating interaction instead of just reacting. This is a breakthrough. Liam, aware that his presence was now an integral part of Emily's communication, began experimenting with ways to encourage her deliberate gestures. He would narrate simple questions, such as asking if she wanted to hear a story or prompting her to indicate which drawing in his sketchbook she preferred. Emily's responses were clear and intentional. She would lift her hand to select a page, press lightly to acknowledge, or move her fingers to follow his guidance. These interactions revealed a level of cognitive engagement that had not been evident before. Sarah documented each of these moments, recognizing the extraordinary significance of the progress. Emily's increasing ability to initiate communication also allowed for more emotionally resonant interactions. She began to respond to affectionate words with subtle gestures, curling her fingers around Sarah's hand when comforted and pressing her palm lightly against Liam's in moments of recognition. Each deliberate action reflected both awareness and emotional understanding of the people around her. One morning, Sarah entered the room and greeted her mother softly. Emily's eyes tracked her movement, and she lifted her hand to reach towards Sarah without any prompting. Sarah grasped her mother's hand gently, squeezing it and holding it against her chest. Emily responded by curling her fingers around Sarah's, maintaining contact for several seconds, a clear and deliberate sign of recognition. Liam watched, beaming quietly, and instinctively placed his hand atop theirs. Emily responded with a coordinated movement, holding all three hands together for a brief, deliberate moment. It was a simple act, yet it carried profound meaning, a nonverbal affirmation of connection and understanding. Reynolds reviewed the monitors, noting the consistency of Emily's responses. These deliberate gestures are accompanied by measurable physiological changes, he observed. Her brain is processing intentional actions and emotional stimuli simultaneously. The implications for recovery are significant. Meyer recorded the session carefully, noting each hand movement, blink, and facial expression. She remarked to Sarah, "We were observing a true emergence of conscious awareness. She's communicating her recognition of you and Liam through intentional gestures." The structured sessions continued, providing Emily with consistent opportunities to exercise her developing abilities. Liam's storytelling, gentle touch, and interactive prompts encouraged deliberate responses, while Sarah's emotional support reinforced recognition and connection. Over time, Emily's repertoire of gestures expanded. She began to respond to simple yes or no questions by curling a finger or pressing lightly, a nonverbal method of communication that was becoming increasingly reliable. The medical team noted that these actions were voluntary and intentional, reflecting both cognitive function and emotional engagement. Emily's ability to initiate gestures also allowed her to communicate preferences, such as indicating which sketches she wanted to look at or signaling when she was ready for a short rest. Each successful interaction reinforced her emerging independence and the restoration of her agency. Liam and Sarah began to introduce more structured activities to encourage further engagement. They would present simple choices, ask questions, and narrate small events, observing Emily's responses carefully. Each deliberate gesture, hand movement, and subtle facial expression became a form of communication, a window into her recovering consciousness. Reynolds continued to analyze the data meticulously. He noted that Emily's voluntary gestures corresponded with spikes in brain activity, heart rate variations, and subtle changes in facial muscles, all indicating active processing and intentionality. The combination of emotional connection, structured interaction, and consistent support was producing measurable neuroplastic changes, accelerating Emily's recovery in a way that traditional medical interventions alone had not achieved. Sarah observed the profound effect of this progression on the family dynamic. Emily's ability to communicate intentionally, even in small ways, strengthened the bond between mother and daughter and created a shared sense of achievement. Liam, too, experienced a growing sense of purpose, understanding that his care and attention were directly contributing to Emily's recovery. The hospital room, once dominated by machines and medical procedures, now became a place of connection, dialogue, and emotional exchange. Each session brought a tangible sense of hope, marking the transition from passive observation to active, intentional communication. Emily's gestures, though subtle, conveyed recognition, preference, and emotional understanding. Her fingers could follow directions, indicate choices, and respond to affectionate words. Her eyes tracked movement with intent, and her facial expressions reflected comprehension and acknowledgement. Dear Reynolds commented, "We are now witnessing deliberate communication. Emily is choosing how to respond and when. This represents a significant milestone in her cognitive and emotional recovery." Emmer added, "The combination of consistent emotional stimulus and structured guidance has enabled her to regain agency. These gestures are purposeful and meaningful." Over the following weeks, Emily's deliberate gestures continued to expand in complexity and consistency. She could now indicate preferences, respond to questions, and engage in simple nonverbal dialogues with both Sarah and Liam. Each success reinforced the family's confidence and hope, marking a turning point in the journey from unresponsiveness to conscious interaction. The structured sessions, combined with genuine emotional engagement, had created a framework in which Emily could safely and steadily reclaim her autonomy. Every gesture, every deliberate hand movement, and every subtle expression represented not only neurological progress but also the profound power of human connection. By the end of this period, Emily Saunders was no longer a passive patient. She was an active participant in her own recovery, communicating intentionally through gestures and expressions, demonstrating awareness, and emotionally engaging with the people she loved most. The family, the child, and the medical team had together created an environment where healing was not only possible, it was happening, one deliberate gesture at a time. By this stage, Emily Saunders' progress had entered a phase that left both her family and the medical team in awe. The deliberate gestures that had begun as subtle twitches were now coordinated and purposeful. She could follow complex sequences of movements with Liam, responding to multi-step prompts and demonstrating a growing understanding of spatial orientation and timing. Sarah documented these sessions meticulously, noting each hand motion, blink, and facial expression as the patterns became increasingly sophisticated. Emily's ability to process sequential instructions was remarkable. When Liam guided her to point to a particular sketch, press a finger for acknowledgement, and then reach for another object, she completed each step deliberately without hesitation or confusion. These actions demonstrated that her brain was not only regaining motor control but also the ability to plan and execute actions with intentionality. Reynolds reviewed the neurological data, comparing the readings from earlier sessions. The results were striking. Emily's EEG patterns showed increased complexity with synchronized spikes indicating active cognitive engagement. Heart rate and respiratory patterns also reflected her growing attentiveness and emotional involvement. Her neural pathways are reorganizing rapidly, Reynolds noted. We were observing an integration of sensory input, motor control, an emotional processing that is highly indicative of emerging consciousness and higher-order cognition. Emily monitored Emily's subtle facial expressions, noting signs of recognition, pleasure, and engagement. Emily now responded to familiar voices with nuanced gestures, tilting her head towards Sarah, curling her fingers around Liam's hand in a gentle but deliberate grip, or making a slight nod that suggested comprehension. Each reaction demonstrated that her mind was actively interpreting and responding to the world around her. Liam had become an expert at reading these subtle cues. He had learned that a slight lift of Emily's wrist indicated readiness to engage, that a small curl of her fingers meant agreement or attention, and that a shift of her eyes could signal comprehension. Using these cues, he guided her through increasingly complex interactions, including simple question and answer sequences and choice-based prompts. Sarah facilitated these sessions, providing encouragement and emotional reinforcement. Her presence ensured that Emily felt safe and supported, allowing her to focus fully on interacting with Liam and responding with intention. Emily's progress was not merely physical, her cognitive abilities were improving at an impressive rate. She began to exhibit signs of memory retention and recognition, recalling details of previous sessions and responding consistently to recurring stimuli. For example, when Liam mentioned a story he had told the previous day, Emily's fingers and eyes would respond in anticipation, reflecting awareness of continuity and temporal connection. The implications were profound. Reynolds and Emily began discussing the potential for Emily to regain full consciousness, noting that her current level of responsiveness suggested she could engage meaningfully with her environment in the near future. "We are witnessing complex cognition in a patient who was unresponsive for months," Drezer. Reynolds said, his voice tinged with both excitement and caution. "This is the point where we can reasonably forecast continued improvement, possibly toward full recovery." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and exhilaration. After months of uncertainty, the signs were unmistakable. Her mother's awareness was returning, and her ability to communicate, even non-verbally, was expanding rapidly. She watched Emily respond to Liam's storytelling with more pronounced gestures, a slight shift of her head, and subtle facial expressions that mirrored emotion, indicating comprehension and engagement. Liam, aware of his mother's emotional reactions, continued to refine his interactions. He presented Emily with choices between objects, prompted her to follow multi-step directions, and observed her responses carefully. Emily's actions were deliberate, coordinated, and increasingly complex. She could indicate preferences, acknowledge instructions, and engage in basic problem-solving tasks guided by Liam's cues. Each session built upon the last, creating a cumulative effect that accelerated her recovery. Reynolds and Emily documented these milestones, noting that Emily's responses reflected a convergence of motor recovery, cognitive awareness, and emotional engagement. They began to discuss the next phase, gradually reintroducing verbal prompts, sensory stimuli, and more interactive exercises that could stimulate speech, comprehension, and independent action. The team recognized that Emily's progress was unprecedented in its speed and depth, largely due to the unique and sustained emotional connection established with Liam. Sarah facilitated the sessions with careful attention to both her mother's capabilities and emotional needs. She encouraged Liam to interact naturally, narrate stories, ask questions, and observe Emily's responses. This combination of structure and spontaneity appeared to be key to the rapid improvement in her neurological and cognitive function. Over the following days, Emily's capacity for communication continued to expand. She could now respond consistently to yes or no prompts using hand gestures, follow multi-step instructions without hesitation, and demonstrate understanding of spatial relationships and sequential events. Her ability to anticipate Liam's storytelling, recognize familiar objects, and respond to prompts indicated an emerging memory and comprehension that had been absent for months. Sarah noticed that Emily's gestures became more fluid and deliberate. Her hands would reach out purposefully, her fingers flexing with intent, and her eyes followed objects and people with focus and awareness. Even subtle expressions, a slight furrowing of her brow, a small nod, or a brief smile reflected both comprehension and emotional engagement. Liam had become an essential part of this process. His presence, intuition, and empathy guided Emily's interactions, allowing her to exercise both motor and cognitive skills. He had become a bridge between her dormant consciousness and the active world, fostering engagement, recognition, and purposeful action. The medical team began planning for the next stage of rehabilitation. They discussed introducing simple verbal prompts, auditory stimuli, and interactive exercises to further stimulate cognitive recovery. Reynolds noted that Emily's current level of responsiveness indicated a high likelihood of continued improvement and potential full recovery, given the consistent emotional and cognitive stimulation provided by Liam and Sarah. Emily's growing awareness also allowed her to demonstrate emotional responses more clearly. She began to react to Sarah's voice with signs of comfort and recognition, and to Liam's presence with subtle but deliberate gestures of acknowledgement and engagement. These responses further reinforced the family's hope and solidified the therapeutic approach that had emerged from the child's initial involvement. By the end of this period, Emily Saunders was no longer merely reacting, she was actively participating in her recovery. Her gestures, facial expressions, and coordinated movements reflected intentionality, cognitive awareness, and emotional understanding. Each session with Liam and Sarah brought measurable neurological improvement and strengthened the bonds between mother, daughter, and child. The trajectory of her progress suggested that full recovery was possible. Dr. Reynolds and Meyer, having observed the consistent pattern of neurological and cognitive improvement, allowed themselves to envision a future in which Emily would regain full independence, communicate effectively, and resume meaningful interactions with her family and the world. The structured sessions, combined with genuine emotional connection, had created an environment where her mind could reawaken, her body could follow, and her family could once again experience the presence of the woman they loved. The remarkable acceleration in her responses, her complex cognition, and the emerging emotional awareness all pointed to one undeniable conclusion: Emily Saunders' journey of recovery, nurtured by empathy, persistence, and human connection, was now on a path toward complete restoration. The day Emily Saunders first made a sound that resembled a word marked a milestone no one in her hospital room would ever forget. After months of coordinated gestures and deliberate hand movements, a soft, breathy cessive escaped her lips as Sarah's voice filled the room. Sarah, who had been leaning close to her mother's bedside, felt her heart leap. She leaned in further, her eyes wide with disbelief and hope. "Mom," she whispered, her voice trembling. Emily's eyes tracked hers, a flicker of recognition evident, and she attempted again, a slightly clearer sound forming. Liam, sitting beside her, gasped softly and reached out, pressing his small hand gently against hers. Emily responded by curling her fingers around his, maintaining the gesture deliberately. The combination of sound and coordinated hand movements signaled a breakthrough. Emily was beginning to engage not only physically and cognitively but now vocally as well. Dr. Reynolds, who had been observing from across the room, quickly checked the monitors and EEG readings. He noted increased brain activity coinciding with the vocalizations. "This is extraordinary," he murmured, a mixture of awe and professional excitement in his voice. "She is integrating motor, cognitive, and now vocal pathways. We are seeing the earliest signs of speech recovery." Meyer, the head nurse, moved closer to document the moment. She recorded the vocal attempts, noting the pitch, duration, and timing in relation to Liam and Sarah's presence. Her eyes glistened with tears. She had witnessed many comatose recoveries, but the combination of cognitive, emotional, and now vocal response was unprecedented. Emily's initial sounds were short, breathy attempts, usually coinciding with a touch from Liam or the sound of Sarah calling her name. The family quickly realized the importance of using familiar names and phrases to encourage her vocal responses. When Sarah whispered, "Emily, it's me, Sarah," her mother's eyes followed her and she attempted to replicate the first syllable, curling her fingers around Sarah's hand as if acknowledging the voice. Liam, eager to participate, gently guided her hand in small, comforting motions, murmuring words of encouragement. Each attempt at vocalization was met with immediate recognition and reinforcement from the family. Over the following days, Emily's attempts became more consistent and controlled. She began to produce the first syllables of her own name, EM, often accompanying the sounds with intentional movements of her hands to indicate acknowledgement or engagement. Sarah and Liam celebrated each attempt quietly but enthusiastically, knowing these small vocal milestones were crucial in restoring her capacity for verbal communication. The medical team continued monitoring, noting that each vocalization correlated with measurable neurological activity and increased engagement with her surroundings. Dr. Reynolds emphasized the significance. These initial vocal attempts are evidence of neural reintegration. She is connecting motor function, speech centers, and emotional processing. This is a critical stage toward functional communication. Emily's vocal efforts were often accompanied by deliberate eye movements, coordinated gestures, and slight facial expressions indicating comprehension. She responded to familiar names and voices with subtle but recognizable changes in expression, demonstrating emerging social awareness. Liam began to adapt his approach, repeating simple, familiar words, encouraging Emily to mimic sounds, and observing the subtle cues that signaled readiness. Sarah continued to provide emotional reinforcement, holding Emily's hand, whispering her name, and celebrating each successful attempt. Each session became a blend of therapeutic exercise and emotional connection, reinforcing the association between sound recognition and social engagement. Emily's progress was gradual but consistent. She began to respond when called by her own name, turning her head deliberately and attempting vocalizations in reply. The coordinated movements of her hands and fingers were now synchronized with her sounds, creating a pattern that was clearly intentional. Sarah documented the frequency, timing, and context of each vocal attempt, while Reynolds analyzed the corresponding neurological data. The pattern suggested that Emily was not only producing sound but actively processing auditory stimuli, recognizing familiar voices, and attempting to respond appropriately. Era noted the emotional impact of these developments. The fact that she is responding to names and using sound to communicate indicates significant cognitive recovery, she said. She is beginning to re-establish a connection with her environment and the people she knows. Liam was encouraged to continue using familiar names and phrases, along with consistent hand guidance and storytelling. Emily began to attempt short vowel sounds first, then combinations that approximated consonant-vowel syllables. Each session revealed incremental improvements in clarity and control, reflecting both motor recovery and cognitive awareness. Over time, Emily began to respond not just to her own name but to those of Sarah and Liam. When Sarah called out, "Emily, it's me," her mother would turn her head, track her daughter's movement with her eyes, and attempt a soft, breathy approximation of sigh while curling her fingers around Sarah's hand. Liam, hearing his own name, prompted a similar reaction, with Emily curling her fingers around his hand and attempting the initial syllable of his name. The integration of recognition, gesture, and vocalization demonstrated a level of awareness and social engagement that had previously been absent. These sessions, carefully documented by the medical team, revealed measurable neurological responses associated with vocal attempts, eye tracking, and intentional hand movements. The consistency of these responses provided a clear trajectory toward functional verbal communication. Emily's emotional engagement also increased. She responded to familiar voices with gestures, slight smiles, and vocal attempts that coincided with moments of recognition. When Sarah spoke softly and affectionately, Emily's fingers would flex deliberately, her gaze would focus intently, and she would attempt to echo syllables, demonstrating both comprehension and desire to interact. Liam, now fully aware of the impact of his presence, continued to use storytelling, gentle guidance, and repetition of familiar words to encourage vocalization. He observed Emily's subtle reactions and adjusted his approach intuitively, providing an ideal blend of stimulation and comfort. Sarah continued her role as both facilitator and emotional anchor, celebrating each attempt and reinforcing the association between names, recognition, and vocalization. The sessions evolved into structured exercises that encouraged Emily to produce more coherent sounds, integrate gestures, and demonstrate cognitive recognition. Each small success built on the previous one, accelerating progress and strengthening the neural pathways associated with speech, comprehension, and social interaction. Emily's first coherent attempt at her own name, Emily, was met with quiet tears from Sarah and beaming pride from Liam. Reynolds and Emir monitored the physiological data, confirming that each vocalization corresponded with increased neurological activity and heightened engagement with her environment. The integration of sound, gesture, and recognition marked a pivotal moment in her recovery. Emily's ability to respond to names, produce vowel and consonant combinations, and integrate deliberate hand movements demonstrated that her consciousness and awareness were expanding rapidly. This phase of recovery signaled the restoration of functional communication, paving the way for verbal interactions, memory recall, and the deepening of emotional connections with Sarah, Liam, and the broader world. Each session reinforced the principle that human connection, empathy, and consistent engagement were powerful drivers of neurological and emotional recovery. The initial syllables, repeated attempts, and growing recognition of familiar voices provided the foundation for Emily Saunders' continued journey toward full vocal communication and reintegration into her life. After weeks of consistent therapy and careful monitoring, Emily Saunders began forming her first coherent words, transforming her previously limited vocal attempts into short, meaningful phrases. The breakthrough started slowly, with small combinations of consonants and vowels gradually forming recognizable syllables, but the significance was unmistakable. Sarah and Liam were present for nearly every session, guiding her patiently, celebrating each utterance, and providing the emotional reinforcement necessary for her confidence to grow. One morning, as Sarah leaned close, whispering, "Mom, do you want to see the drawings Liam made today?" Emily's lips moved carefully, forming a soft, deliberate yes. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as tears threatened to spill. Liam's small hand touched Emily's in encouragement, and she responded by curling her fingers gently around his. It was a simple exchange, yet monumental. From this point onward, short verbal interactions became a central component of Emily's recovery. Each session was carefully structured to integrate speech with gestures and emotional connection. Liam would ask simple questions, such as, "Do you want the blue one or the red one?" Emily would respond verbally with blue or red, accompanied by deliberate finger movements to reinforce comprehension. Sarah documented every response, noting consistency, vocal clarity, and any accompanying emotional expression. Reynolds and Emmer observed the sessions closely, capturing data on brain activity, heart rate, and motor function. The integration of speech with physical gestures indicated that Emily's cognitive processes were not only returning but also coordinating effectively across multiple neural pathways. "We are seeing functional communication emerge," Dr. Reynolds said quietly to Emmer. "She is processing questions, choosing responses, and expressing herself intentionally. This is far beyond reflexive reaction." Mara nodded, keeping her eyes on Emily. "Her emotional engagement is equally significant," she added. "She's not just repeating sounds, she's interacting with purpose and comprehension." Emily's ability to communicate in this way strengthened over subsequent days. She began to respond to greetings, acknowledge names, and answer simple questions, demonstrating both cognitive recognition and emotional awareness. Liam and Sarah adapted their approach to accommodate her growing capabilities. They introduced small storytelling exercises in which Emily could respond verbally to questions, predict outcomes, or indicate preferences. For example, Liam would describe a short scene about a bird hopping across a fence and ask, "Will the bird fly or stay?" Emily would respond with a soft, deliberate fly, often accompanied by a small gesture of her hand or fingers to emphasize understanding. These interactions reinforced her cognitive engagement while providing structured opportunities to practice verbal communication. Sarah noticed that Emily began initiating speech independently, attempting short phrases without prompting. When Liam arrived and greeted her, she would respond with a clear "Hi, Liam," or answer, "I'm here," reflecting both awareness and social recognition. Each independent attempt strengthened her confidence and encouraged further interaction. Over time, Emily's verbal responses became more consistent, accurate, and expressive. She started forming basic questions such as "Where is Sarah?" or "Want water?" Each question demonstrated awareness of her surroundings, memory of her family members, and a desire to engage meaningfully with them. Liam and Sarah responded with excitement, reinforcing her attempts and maintaining a nurturing environment. The structured sessions continued to evolve. Dr. Reynolds suggested inducing simple conversational exchanges, such as sharing brief stories, describing objects, and asking Emily to respond with short phrases or yes/no answers. These exercises not only encouraged speech but also strengthened cognitive associations, memory recall, and comprehension. Emily's ability to respond to these prompts consistently marked a significant milestone in her recovery. She was no longer a passive participant but an active communicator, capable of expressing needs, preferences, and emotions verbally. Sarah recorded each session carefully, tracking vocal clarity, consistency, and response times. She noted emotional cues such as small smiles, eye contact, and hand gestures that complemented Emily's words, reinforcing the depth of her awareness. Liam's presence remained crucial. His gentle guidance, consistent storytelling, and empathetic approach provided the ideal balance of stimulation and support, encouraging Emily to practice speech without frustration or pressure. Each interaction strengthened neural pathways associated with language, cognition, and emotional processing. One afternoon, as Liam described a scene from their neighborhood, Emily responded with a short phrase, "Bird runs fast." Her voice deliberate and expressive. Sarah and Liam both smiled broadly, understanding that these small sentences represented a remarkable leap in her ability to communicate and conceptualize her environment. Dr. Reynolds reviewed the monitors, noting synchronized brain activity corresponding to the verbal responses. "We are seeing higher-order cognitive processing," he remarked. "Emily is integrating sensory input, memory, language, and emotional recognition. Her recovery is progressing remarkably." Emmer nodded, observing Emily's subtle facial expressions, hand gestures, and body movements. The combination of speech, gesture, and recognition shows that she is now fully engaging with her environment, she said. Over the following weeks, Emily's verbal interactions expanded. She began using short sentences, answering questions with complete phrases, and expressing simple emotions, such as "I'm happy" or "I like that." Sarah and Liam encouraged these expressions, maintaining a supportive environment while gradually introducing more complex conversational opportunities. Each success reinforced Emily's confidence and accelerated her recovery. Social interactions became an integral part of her therapy. She began responding to greetings from staff, recognizing familiar faces, and initiating short verbal exchanges with Liam and Sarah. These interactions were accompanied by coordinated gestures and expressions reflecting full engagement, awareness, and emotional connectivity. Dr. Reynolds highlighted the importance of this stage. "We are witnessing the emergence of functional communication," he explained. "She is able to express needs, answer questions, and participate in basic conversation. This is a critical step toward regaining autonomy and social integration." Sarah documented every session, noting each verbal attempt, gesture, and facial expression. Liam continued to guide and encourage, providing both emotional support and cognitive stimulation. The combination of consistent interactions, structured prompts, and genuine care created an environment in which Emily could practice and refine her communication skills. Emily's progress in verbal communication also enhanced her emotional engagement. She began expressing simple preferences, showing excitement or curiosity through words, and using speech to indicate comfort or discomfort. Each verbalization was accompanied by deliberate gestures, eye contact, and subtle facial expressions, reinforcing the depth of her awareness and connection with those around her. By the end of this phase, Emily Saunders had transitioned from producing isolated syllables to engaging in basic, meaningful verbal exchanges with Sarah and Liam. She could answer questions, express preferences, initiate greetings, and respond emotionally, all through coordinated speech, gestures, and recognition. This stage of her recovery marked a critical turning point. She was actively communicating, cognitively engaged, and emotionally present, demonstrating that the combination of human connection, structured interaction, and consistent therapy had successfully fostered functional verbal communication. Emily Saunders' recovery had reached a remarkable stage. No longer limited to brief gestures or single words, she now engaged in longer, more dynamic interactions that reflected both cognitive flexibility and emotional awareness. Sarah and Liam noticed that she could sustain attention for extended periods, following multi-step instructions, responding to questions, and even initiating brief conversational exchanges. The hospital room, once dominated by the sterile hum of machinery, had transformed into a space of active dialogue and shared discovery, where Emily's presence was increasingly tangible. Each morning, Liam arrived with a sketchbook, small toys, or stories to tell, and Emily responded with enthusiasm. She could now participate in interactive games, indicate preferences, and engage with objects in ways that demonstrated both understanding and intention. When Liam asked, "Do you want the blue or red toy?" Emily would respond verbally with blue, accompanied by a deliberate gesture, pointing or reaching toward her choice. Sarah observed that these interactions were no longer rigid or repetitive. Emily demonstrated adaptability, adjusting her responses according to new information or changing instructions. Gr. Reynolds monitored the sessions closely, noting significant improvements in neurological coordination, attention span, and processing speed. The integration of speech, gesture, and emotional recognition suggested that Emily's brain was reorganizing effectively, with emerging pathways supporting higher-order cognitive functions. MI recorded each session meticulously, highlighting Emily's growing ability to maintain focus, follow instructions, and engage with both Liam and Sarah simultaneously. These improvements were not limited to structured exercises. Emily began to respond spontaneously, initiating interactions, reaching out to touch or hold hands, and vocalizing simple sentences without prompting. Her growing independence in communication reflected not only neurological recovery but also emotional resilience and confidence. On one afternoon, Liam described a scene from their neighborhood, asking Emily to anticipate what might happen next. She responded with a short sentence, "Dog runs fast," and followed it with a deliberate hand gesture to indicate understanding. Sarah and Liam exchanged a glance, both filled with pride and relief. The consistency and accuracy of her responses demonstrated an impressive level of cognitive integration. Emily's ability to adapt and respond flexibly extended to social interactions as well. She began to recognize staff members, respond to greetings appropriately, and express preferences or emotions verbally. A smile, a nod, or a brief sentence such as "I like that" or "I'm ready" became part of her daily repertoire, reflecting her growing awareness of her surroundings and the people in them. The family gradually introduced more complex activities to foster both cognitive and social recovery. Storytelling exercises became interactive, with Emily predicting outcomes, responding to questions, and even asking brief, simple questions herself. Each exchange required her to process information, plan a response, and execute both verbal and physical gestures intentionally. These sessions, combining structure with emotional support, significantly accelerated her recovery. Emily's endurance during these longer interactions increased steadily. She could maintain focus for extended periods, following multi-step instructions, responding to changes in context, and participating in interactive activities that challenged both cognition and motor control. Sarah observed that Emily's attention span was improving in parallel with her ability to process information and respond intentionally. Dr. Reynolds highlighted that this combination of attention, verbal communication, and purposeful gesture indicated robust neurological recovery. Her executive functions are emerging, he noted. She's demonstrating attention, planning, and intentional action in real time. This level of recovery is extraordinary given the initial severity of her condition. Meyer reinforced these observations, emphasizing the importance of maintaining a balance between structured exercises and natural interaction. Emily's spontaneous engagement and adaptive responses were key indicators that she was reclaiming not only basic functions but also meaningful participation in her environment. Emily's emotional responses became increasingly nuanced. She expressed pleasure, curiosity, and even mild frustration verbally and physically, using gestures, facial expressions, and speech to convey her feelings. When Sarah asked, "Do you want to try drawing today?" Emily's eyes brightened, and she responded, "Yes, please," reaching for the sketchbook. Liam, observing her enthusiasm, adjusted his storytelling and engagement to match her emotional cues, creating a dynamic and responsive interaction that reinforced her cognitive and social development. Over time, Emily's ability to interact flexibly allowed her to engage in more complex tasks. She could follow sequences of instructions, combine verbal responses with hand movements, and demonstrate comprehension of new concepts introduced during the sessions. Her capacity to adapt to changing scenarios indicated not only cognitive recovery but also an emerging confidence in her abilities. The medical team began preparing for gradual reintegration into more normal activities outside the hospital. Speech therapy, occupational therapy, and guided mobility exercises were introduced in parallel with ongoing interactive sessions with Sarah and Liam. Emily responded well to these interventions, demonstrating both adaptability and willingness to participate actively. Each day brought tangible evidence of progress. Emily could carry out short conversations, respond to questions with appropriate verbal and physical gestures, and express preferences or opinions with increasing clarity. Sarah noted that the combination of structured exercises, emotional support, and spontaneous engagement was essential in fostering these improvements. Emily's interactions were no longer solely reactive. She was becoming proactive, initiating communication, asking simple questions, and expressing desires. This shift from reactive to proactive engagement marked a critical milestone in her journey toward functional independence. Liam's role remained central. His presence, guidance, and empathetic engagement continued to stimulate both cognitive and emotional recovery. He adapted naturally to Emily's evolving abilities, providing prompts when needed, observing her subtle cues, and encouraging her to take initiative. The family's collaboration with the medical team ensured that these interactions were both meaningful and therapeutically effective. Dr. Reynolds emphasized that Emily's ability to sustain longer interactions, respond flexibly, and communicate verbally indicated a strong potential for returning to everyday life. "We are now observing an integration of multiple cognitive, motor, and emotional processes," he said. "This is the stage where functional independence becomes a realistic goal." Emily's daily sessions became increasingly dynamic. She could participate in conversations lasting several minutes, engage with multiple people simultaneously, and respond appropriately to changing instructions or stimuli. These improvements reflected a reintegration of cognitive, emotional, and social functions, signaling that she was on a trajectory toward normal life activities. Sarah and Liam documented each session, noting improvements in speech clarity, cognitive flexibility, social engagement, and emotional awareness. The combination of deliberate verbal responses, intentional gestures, and emotional expression demonstrated that Emily was reclaiming autonomy and agency in her interactions. By the end of this period, Emily Saunders had progressed from brief, reactive gestures to sustained, purposeful interaction. She could communicate verbally, respond flexibly to her environment, and engage socially with her family and caregivers. Her recovery had reached a stage where participation in daily life, decision-making, and meaningful engagement became possible, marking a profound transformation from the months of unresponsiveness that had once defined her condition. Months of patient effort, structured therapy, and emotional support had culminated in a miraculous recovery. Emily Saunders, once entirely unresponsive, was now fully aware, communicative, and engaged with her family and surroundings. Her speech, though still gently paced, was coherent, expressive, and consistent. She could participate in conversations, follow complex instructions, and express her thoughts, preferences, and emotions with clarity. The first moments of full recognition, the smile when she saw Sarah or Liam, the laugh that erupted spontaneously during a shared story were moments the family cherished deeply, knowing the long, arduous journey that had preceded them. Sarah observed her mother interacting naturally with Liam, guiding him as he shared small anecdotes about his day. Emily would respond verbally, ask simple questions, and even offer gentle corrections when a story was exaggerated for effect, demonstrating both cognitive recovery and a lively sense of humor. The room, once a sterile space dominated by machines and monitors, now felt alive with energy, conversation, and genuine emotional connection. Dr. Reynolds and Meyer, who had witnessed Emily's gradual progression from subtle gestures to intentional speech, celebrated this stage of recovery with measured excitement. The data from recent sessions revealed robust neural integration, coordination of cognitive and motor functions, and consistent social engagement, all indicators of complete recovery from a coma that had lasted months. Emily's independence had grown remarkably. She could move with assistance, engage in meaningful dialogue, and navigate her surroundings with awareness. Simple activities like choosing her breakfast, arranging her sketchbooks, or guiding Liam through storytelling exercises became evidence of regained autonomy. Sarah and Liam observed these moments, understanding that every small interaction now carried meaning, choice, and intention. The journey that had begun with a chance encounter in a hospital hallway had transformed into a full-fledged recovery, driven by empathy, persistence, and human connection. With Emily regaining her voice mobility and cognitive clarity, the family began to reflect on the broader significance of their experience. They realized that the combination of structured sessions, emotional support, and genuine interpersonal connection had played an essential role in her recovery. Inspired by the profound impact of these interactions, Emily, Sarah, and Liam began discussing ways to share this approach with others. The idea for a specialized center dedicated to emotional therapy for patients in prolonged unconsciousness or with limited responsiveness was born. They envisioned a space where children, family members, and trained professionals could engage with patients in meaningful ways, providing emotional and cognitive stimulation that traditional medical interventions alone could not achieve. Reynolds, who had become an integral part of Emily's journey, provided guidance and insight into the practical and clinical aspects of such a center. Mara contributed her nursing expertise, emphasizing the importance of safe, structured interactions while maintaining the authenticity and empathy that had proven so effective in Emily's recovery. Sarah and Emily worked together to design the framework. They planned programs that incorporated storytelling, interactive games, tactile stimulation, and guided conversation, with a focus on creating connections that could inspire neurological and emotional recovery. Liam, whose presence had been pivotal in Emily's own journey, would serve as a key participant and mentor for children involved in the therapy, sharing his innate empathy and intuitive understanding of patient engagement. The family conducted preliminary workshops with other patients and families at the hospital, testing activities and gathering feedback. The results were promising. Patients responded to simple, structured interactions with increased awareness, subtle gestures, and, in some cases, measurable vocalizations. The team documented these responses meticulously, using Emily's journey as a model to refine techniques, create guidelines, and provide training for participants. Over time, they secured funding and support to establish the Emotional Therapy and Recovery Center, a facility dedicated to applying the lessons learned from Emily's recovery on a broader scale. The center combined clinical oversight with family engagement, structured interaction, and the intuitive presence of children trained to provide meaningful, empathetic support. Emily, fully recovered, took an active role in the center. She worked with Sarah and Liam to guide patients through exercises, share her experiences, and demonstrate the power of human connection in recovery. Her story became an inspiration for families, patients, and medical professionals alike, showing that empathy, patience, and emotional engagement could achieve results that often seemed beyond conventional medicine. Dr. Reynolds continued to collaborate with the center, contributing clinical expertise and helping to measure outcomes scientifically. Amryer oversaw safety and procedural standards, ensuring that all interactions maintained both therapeutic integrity and genuine human connection. Sarah managed day-to-day operations, integrating the lessons learned from her mother's recovery into practical programs that families could participate in easily and meaningfully. The center quickly gained recognition for its innovative approach. Families reported improvements in patient responsiveness, increased emotional engagement, and heightened cognitive activity during and after sessions. The integration of children, family members, and trained volunteers into structured therapy provided a unique combination of emotional stimulation, social engagement, and cognitive challenge, resulting in measurable and meaningful progress for patients. Emily's journey became both a foundation and a symbol for the center. Her story illustrated the potential of emotional and human-centered therapy, demonstrating how structured, empathetic interaction could accelerate recovery, restore communication, and strengthen social bonds. The center's programs emphasized flexibility, allowing patients to engage according to their own pace and abilities while ensuring that children and family members were trained to provide consistent, meaningful stimulation. Emily's active participation reinforced the credibility of the methods, as she could communicate her experience, guide exercises, and demonstrate recovery milestones in a relatable, inspiring manner. Families involved in the center often expressed profound gratitude. They observed improvements in patients who had previously shown minimal responsiveness, and the emotional connections forged during sessions were as impactful for the family members as for the patients themselves. Liam's role as a mentor and facilitator proved especially powerful. His intuitive, empathetic interactions, honed through his experience with Emily, provided a model for other children involved in therapy, emphasizing the importance of genuine care, attention, and patience. The center grew steadily, incorporating research, community outreach, and training programs for both families and medical professionals. Emily, Sarah, and Liam traveled occasionally to share their story, advocate for emotional therapy, and inspire other institutions to recognize the value of integrating empathy, structured interaction, and human connection into rehabilitation practices. Emily's full recovery was no longer measured solely by her physical or cognitive abilities, but by her ability to engage fully with her family, participate meaningfully in therapy sessions, and contribute actively to the emotional and social rehabilitation of others. Her life had returned not only to normalcy but to purpose, as she became an active advocate for the healing power of human connection. The Saunders family's journey, which had begun with a tragic accident and months of uncertainty, had culminated in a triumph that extended far beyond personal recovery. The creation of the Emotional Therapy and Recovery Center allowed their experience to benefit countless others, demonstrating that empathy, patience, and human interaction could unlock possibilities previously thought unattainable. Emily's story became a living testament to the extraordinary potential of the human mind, the resilience of the spirit, and the transformative power of love, care, and connection. Every success at the center reminded them of the day a small boy, driven by curiosity and kindness, had wandered into a hospital room and sparked a miracle. That single act had set in motion a journey that restored a life, strengthened a family, and created a legacy capable of changing the way recovery was understood and approached for generations to come. The story of Emily Saunders' recovery offers a profound lesson in the extraordinary power of human connection and empathy. From the very beginning, when a small, curious child named Liam wandered into a hospital room by chance, it became clear that healing is not solely the product of medicine, technology, or professional intervention. The subtle interaction between Liam and Emily revealed that the human mind responds to more than physical stimulus. It responds to attention, care, and genuine emotional engagement. This teaches us that empathy, even when expressed in its simplest forms, has the capacity to awaken consciousness, spark hope, and restore agency to those who may seem unreachable. It challenges the assumption that recovery is a purely clinical process, demonstrating that emotional presence, patience, and compassion can act as catalysts for profound change. The lesson extends beyond medical contexts. It reminds us that every individual, regardless of age or circumstance, can have a meaningful impact on the lives of others. Liam's role in Emily's journey shows that acts of kindness and genuine attention are not bound by expertise or status. Sometimes a child's innocence and authenticity can achieve what professional tools alone cannot. In a world that often prioritizes efficiency and measurable outcomes, this story emphasizes the irreplaceable value of presence, listening, and attentive care. Another important lesson lies in the virtue of patience and perseverance. Emily's recovery did not occur overnight. It unfolded gradually, in incremental steps that were often imperceptible to the untrained eye. For months, her family and the medical team faced uncertainty, frustration, and the heavy weight of unfulfilled hope. Yet, by remaining patient, consistent, and attentive, they created an environment in which Emily could recover at her own pace. This teaches us that meaningful progress, whether in healing, learning, or personal growth, rarely follows a linear path. It requires steadfast commitment, the courage to persevere through setbacks, and the wisdom to recognize that small, repeated efforts can accumulate into profound transformation. The story also underscores the power of collaboration. Emily's journey was not the result of a single person's efforts, but a collective endeavor involving her daughter, a child, and a dedicated medical team. Each participant contributed a unique form of support. Sarah provided emotional guidance and continuity. Liam offered intuitive empathy and interactive engagement, and the medical professionals applied scientific observation and structured care. Together, they created a holistic environment where Emily could recover physically, cognitively, and emotionally. This teaches that collaboration, mutual respect, and recognition of each person's strengths can achieve outcomes far greater than individual effort alone. Furthermore, the narrative highlights the transformative potential of hope and belief. Throughout the months of uncertainty, Sarah and her family held on to the possibility that Emily could recover, nurturing her with stories, attention, and care. This hope was not naive, it was active, intentional, and supported by consistent action. Their unwavering belief in Emily's potential created an atmosphere in which recovery was possible, demonstrating that hope is most powerful when paired with commitment and action. Beyond the immediate context of healing, Emily's story offers lessons for resilience, adaptability, and the human capacity to overcome adversity. Her gradual return to awareness and communication illustrates that even in the face of profound challenges, progress is possible when guided by empathy, connection, and encouragement. It reminds us that human potential is often underestimated and that with the right environment, patience, and support, extraordinary outcomes can emerge. The establishment of the Emotional Therapy and Recovery Center by Emily and her family further extends these lessons. Their experience demonstrates that personal transformation can inspire collective benefit, turning a story of individual recovery into a model that helps countless others. This teaches us the value of using personal insight and lived experience to contribute positively to society, fostering innovation, compassion, and hope in ways that extend beyond a single life. Finally, the story encourages reflection on the fundamental nature of human relationships. Emily's recovery was not only physical or cognitive, it was deeply relational. Her consciousness, agency, and emotional responsiveness flourished because of the attention, care, and love provided by those around her. This reminds us that the bonds we form, the presence we offer, and the care we give to others are not peripheral to life, they are central. They possess the power to awaken, heal, and transform in ways that are often immeasurable yet profoundly real. In essence, the story of Emily Saunders teaches that the greatest catalysts for change are often found in connection, empathy, and unwavering support. It challenges us to recognize the value of human attention and care, to remain patient and persistent in nurturing growth, and to collaborate meaningfully to create environments in which hope, resilience, and recovery can thrive. Her journey serves as a lasting reminder that even the most dire circumstances, compassion, patience, and human connection can unlock potential, transform light, inspire enduring change. The lessons extend to every aspect of life: relationships, work, caregiving, and community engagement, showing that when we invest in others with care, consistency, and empathy, we can create miracles that science alone cannot fully explain. If you found this content helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of my latest videos. If you have any ideas or topics you'd like me to cover, leave a comment below. I always read all your comments.